Great. Well, thank you so much, Prachi and Katie, for this invitation to talk about my favorite topic, of course, quantum science and quantum education. I'm also an affiliate of Duke Quantum Center and their Science and Society Institute, which is part of their public policy school. The stuff I'm going to talk about today is from work related to the National Q12 Education Partnership that Katie mentioned, which is really kind of an infrastructure grant that was set up in 2020, but it was set up under the previous Trump administration and then continued under the Biden administration and then continues today. So I'm very excited to share some of this work that's been happening and also understand how to better support you as educators and people interested in this space. So the first thing I'll start with, sorry, my computer's not really switching. There we go. So I want to say, acknowledge that this year we're celebrating the International Year of Quantum Science and Technology. The United Nations declared last year, they said that this year we're going to celebrate the 100 years of quantum. And so quantum is not really new. So while it is new to many people, I think around the world, the field itself is not new, but it has changed over time. While there were quantum theories actually of nature happening in the early 1900s, around 1905, notably by Einstein and Planck, we really scientists started to really bump up against an issue of the understanding nature at its smallest scales. And so by the 1920s, there was a situation where people were sort of confounded. They had tried to use physical theories to understand nature from the 1800s and early 1900s, and suddenly they were not working. And particularly, they were trying to understand actually how atoms and light interact. And scientists were getting very good at running experiments on atoms and light, and they were seeing discrepancies and could no longer explain what was happening. And so I think Wolfgang Pauli said it very nice. We are speaking a language inadequate to describe the simplicity and beauty of the quantum world. I don't know if I would call it necessarily simple, but it is beautiful, the things that happen at the microscopic scale. And there are tons of pictures about this. Now, I'm not a historian, so I refer you to a lovely essay of Nature from Nature magazine that I think is open, that was published this year in honor of the year, written by a physics historian on this time period. And a lot of things were done. And then within 2 years, there was a better understanding. So if you were to walk around between 1925 and I would say around the year 2000, and somebody said the word quantum, what they were really talking about most likely is quantum mechanics, the theory that explains nature better than the theory we had before, because that's how science works, right? And so before we had this nice theory of classical mechanics. We haven't thrown it out the window because it's a very nice theory for explaining. It's the math that we use to explain nature at bigger scales. But we needed something better, and that's what quantum mechanics is. And it's about understanding and interacting with nature to improve technology, make discoveries, and solve problems. Not everybody in the 20th century were working on all of three of these things at the same time, nor did people expect them to, but the overall output of quantum in the 20th century was to do these things. And oftentimes, if you heard the word quantum, you were walking around, it would be associated with small size of things, atoms and electrons, things like radiation, magnets, light, materials. And typically you started as time went on, as the decades passed, experiments and laboratories started to make things very cold and work in the cryogenic area. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And certainly the words superposition and entanglement, which are quantum concepts, they came up in the 1920s and were ever present, but they were not front and center as what we were manipulating necessarily. Um, so, so really to, kind of just underline why we would celebrate this development of a theory in physics is really it gave us this understanding, which then led to the development of MRI machines, our understanding of new phases of matter like superconductors and superfluidity. We eventually were able to develop lasers. The entirety of the computing industry is based on the modern computing is based on semiconductor technology and other kinds of material storage. And all of that was made possible because we understood how electrons were moving around and conducting electricity in different types of solids. Additionally, as time went on, I draw this dotted line because around the year, I would say around 2000, we sort of started to hit this transition point into what we think about as quantum today. And at the intersection here was actually atomic clocks. So atomic clocks were developed in the later part of the 20th century and into the 21st century as advanced timekeeping devices that we could put on satellites and we use for the global positioning system. So this is a critical 20th century, 21st century technology that sits at that intersection where we started to go from understanding nature and giving us a new understanding that led to technology developments to thinking about how we manipulate nature at these different scales. So nowadays, if you walk around and you hear the word quantum, while we do put this word in front of everything, I think that's a quote from Ant-Man, when you hear the word quantum in a context of science, policy, education, people are generally referring to quantum information science and engineering, which is a cross-disciplinary field that's more than just physics. It's beyond quantum mechanics. It's about controlling those purely quantum features, those quantum features at those small scales to improve technologies, make discoveries, and solve problems. So still the same goals. Not everybody is doing all three of these things in this field, but we're doing something very different, and it's done in a cross-disciplinary way that's working across computer science, engineering, chemistry, physics, mathematics, and so on. Again, things are small. They actually typically are very, very cold, or they're doing something to kind of beat back the heat of nature. And you need to do that to put superposition and entanglement to work in information contexts. So in this talk, I'm not going to talk too much about entanglement. I'm going to say a few words about superposition. And I'm going to also, and I just want to keep an eye on the time, talk about what I mean by putting them to work. So what we're seeing now, and I will say like, people viewed 1920s as a revolution in physics. It was a revolution, an entirely new mathematical framework or set of math equations that we could use to understand nature. That was a revolution in physics. And there are lots of flowery ways people described this at the time, but it was a big deal. I mean, people were really wringing their hands. And so now we're seeing a second revolution. People think of this new age of quantum information as another revolutionary point. And it's not actually, in my estimation, a revolution in the way we understand nature, because it's not a physics revolution. It is an information revolution, a technology revolution. And so here we are isolating and manipulating those features of superposition and entanglement to advance SNT. And the domains that people generally talk about in this area are sensing, networks and communication, and computing and simulation. And I categorize them this way, but there is a lot of overlap actually between these three things. The workhorse for these areas, we call them quantum bits, qubits. There's physics systems, different types of hardware to improve signal detection if you're doing sensing, to try to make more secure communications or build networks using fundamentally quantum systems or quantum objects called qubits, or we're doing computing with these quantum bits. And this is a different kind of computing resource. Quantum computers are not, okay, I don't think, and I think many people don't think, they're not replacing your laptop. They're not replacing your phone. Unfortunately, I don't see a Q iPhone or a Q Pixel or whatever in our future, but they're really a different kind of resource, more like how we think about GPUs and CPUs work in different contexts, and that this would be a QPU that worked in a different context. And they may be useful for decryption, fundamental science, logistics, and quantum chemistry. And I want to be careful here to say that they may be useful because at present, while we actually know that a full-scale quantum computer would be able to decrypt modern encryption protocols, the RSA protocol, and be able to simulate nature better because you're using quantum objects to simulate nature, which is fundamentally quantum. We actually don't have a full-scale quantum computer today, and nobody knows when they will be built. And moreover, we don't actually, beyond these things, know for sure what they will be good for. But that doesn't stop us from wanting to explore and build them, and it's still very important to do so. So Quantum computers, I want to mention just a little bit more about them because I think this is a key point that gets people talk a lot about and hear about quantum computers. Quantum computers manipulate quantum bits. So at the end of a program, you have a high probability of getting a correct answer for a specific problem. So this sounds like a very technical explanation, but I want to point out that regular computers manipulate classical bits, transistor-based bits or magnetic media-based bits or some kind of bit. So regular computers manipulate bits so that at the end of a program, you will get a correct answer for a specific problem. That's the name of the game. And quantum computers modify this because they're manipulating something different than our normal bits. They're doing quantum bits and there's probability involved. And so I put this cartoon up because I should have put the link, that was an oversight. I really like XKCD. Um, but I like to point out that some of what I'm about to talk about is still an open question. It doesn't mean we can't build these devices, but we don't always understand what's going on. So this is a funny comic about, we talk a big game about a theory of everything, but we don't really understand why ice skates work, how sand flows, and where static charge comes from when you rub your hair with a balloon. And I'll add to that, we don't really have a full theory of understanding of some of the things that are happening when you deal with this problem of you have a high probability of getting the right answer. And so not everything is understood, but people are working on that. So what's happening here is that in a quantum computer or any other quantum device, the properties of the quantum bits are like waves before you measure them. And when you measure something about them or you try to read out the information at the end of your quantum program, the answer you get is randomly selected from a set of options. So this is why it's very hard to build a quantum computer, is because not only do you have to build something that works without you measuring anything or looking at it, you need to also be developing a quantum program that gives you, with high probability, the correct answer at the end. Um, so, so this is why it's very hard, is there's this problem of measuring or reading out information at the end and also running the quantum computer without looking at it. Because as soon as you look at it, it's going to get messed up if you're not at the end of the program. And so there are a lot of different companies and organizations that are working on hardware for building quantum computers, but also quantum networks and quantum sensors. And, some of the companies have gone all in on superconducting circuits. Some organizations are all in on ions or atoms. And there's a lot of competition in this field. And there's no clear winner, actually. While at Duke, we are all in on ions and atoms, the scientists working them. I no longer work in a lab and haven't for a long time. And there is no clear winner. One thing people do think will be the case for sure is that somehow we will have to take whatever we're doing and convert it to light. And that's true in our today's computing, is that we have all these fiber networks that convey information over long distances using light. People kind of expect that the same thing is true for a quantum computer or quantum network, is that you might have maybe ions or superconducting circuits or topological qubits or whatever it is doing some computation. But when you want to move that information from one location to another, like we do over the internet, you're going to probably use light. And so photons are most likely part of this story forever. So that's one thing also, when you read about this, it's hard to distill fact from fiction, but while nobody really knows what the best computational quantum hardware is, I think people are pretty sure you're going to need light to transfer the information from one place to another. This is a little technical, but I wanted to share just for those who might be interested in diving in a little bit about which ones are better and if they read about one and it sounds like it's really great. Some qubits and quantum hardware are better than others at different, at different things. So for instance, photons and neutral atoms and ions, which, the companies IonQ and Quantinuum and QEra and PsiQuantum are out there in this domain. and many academic institutions are working in these areas. Those qubits are really hard. They're hard to make many qubits interact, and particularly photons. Ions are much easier to make interact, so these are kind of ordered in this way. But they're so isolated that each quantum bit is easy to keep quantum. So that means that you sort of a little bit for free get the quantum part for each of these bits, but then you've got to work hard to make them interact. On the other side of the spectrum are manufactured qubits, where they interact with nature easily, like superconducting qubits or quantum dots. These are inside of a material and they interact with nature very easily. And so you can make qubits interact very easily. But because they interact with nature very easily in their surroundings, they're very hard to keep quantum. And so the name of the game is, where do you find balance on this? It's a bit technical, but I think it's important because I know these things pop up a lot in different media or public announcements. And, underlying all of this is our people. People have to work on this. It's true in the 20th century. It's true now. I think what's interesting now is we're really looking at this cross-disciplinary workforce that is interacting with each other. Whereas I would say in the 20th century, there was a lot more of this sort of linear progression from basic physics to applied physics to engineering to different domains, and they might not all interact with each other. Whereas I think on the fundamental level, you have a lot of people from different domains interacting in the science and the engineering. And then we're also looking at how do you build a quantum ready workforce across all domains so that you've got future users, people who might be making decisions about this, teachers, and all of these people might need different levels of quantum literacy. So now I'm going to transition from the science a little bit to the education piece. And so what I will say is I get a lot of questions about whether or not we should have quantum in the K-12 space. And I really like this quote by Statterman et al. From Europe, where modern upper secondary school physics would be incomplete without some basic physics concept, quantum physics concepts. And I think this is true just generally I would modify this to say, modern science curricula is incomplete without some basic quantum science concepts. Now, where you fit them in is the trick. So it's definitely a challenge. In the US, we don't have a national system, it's highly localized, but I don't think it's impossible. I do think that we have to balance everything we do in the push for quantum education with the reality on the ground. Teachers are busy, students are busy, there's a lot going on, especially now with AI. There's a lot of questions about what should be taught. And I think, what I've been encouraged by the movement for quantum education is I think overall the community has taken a very thoughtful approach. And I'm just really privileged to be a microphone for this approach where we're trying to really respect what's happening today in science classrooms and how to best support teachers to bring this topic there or to enhance it or build the connections if it already is there. And of course, I think quantum, I get asked this question a lot because I think quantum just generally has a reputation for being only for geniuses and being spooky. And I just think that today's quantum means something very different. And I'm not saying that before it was either only for geniuses or spooky, but nowadays it's such a broad, important field that I think we have to, as a community, have to stop talking about it as if it is the hardest, most unreachable, scary part of science and think really how we're helping the students. So in Europe, quantum concepts are already there in secondary school in publicly available curricula. This is a very limited study, but it does give you a snapshot of what's happening, at least in Europe. We also know that in different areas of schooling that quantum is taught in India and quantum concepts are taught in Asia, different Asia countries, East Asia, China, Australia, other places in the world. So this is not a complete representation of everything. It's just a snapshot of some publicly available curricula. And this again was by Statterman et al. In the US, there are Texas state standards that have quantum in. I think Virginia has the word quantum, and Ohio has some computer science standards with quantum. And there are some emerging connections to next generation science standards, but it's a complicated mess. And it requires, I think, federal policy, but also state policy and district level support to move it forward. And that it's critical that we work with and learn from teachers and figure out locally what makes sense. Today the formal part is happening, but it's going to take, 2 decades to see a lot of signs of significant change. But the informal can happen anytime. And so that's really fun and exciting, I think, for students and teachers, is that there's some flexibility, particularly at the middle school and early high school levels, to figure out ways to bring in some informal activities in quantum while the formal part is taking years slugging through different state systems. And there's a lot of overlap today in these spaces, whereas 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I think there was less overlap of informal education and formal. And so I do think that while formal may take a very long time, I think the fact that there is this overlap, we're going to see more students coming out with quantum awareness, even in the absence of formal curricula. So the resources that Q12, the broader Q12 have developed, community has developed, which some of you may on this call may be a part of, and that are a framework, some informal resources under Quantime, which is I'll talk about, and some careers information. And then I'm gonna go through, breeze through these and then stop and open the floor for questions. So on the formal side, one of the first things the Q12 partnership did was ask around what should we do? And it was clear that there needed to be some type of framework to kind of let people know, where does quantum fit into K-12? And so the first step of this actually predates the Q12 partnership. There was a workshop in 2020. It was the first virtual COVID workshop I had ever been to in March of 2020. And so it wasn't very optimized, I would say. But the question that the participants were asked were, what are the key concepts that we imagine students should know about quantum information science upon graduation? And that put out a list of key concepts. There are 9 of them. And the Q12, when we got a grant from the National Science Foundation, we developed this further by asking, how do the key concepts match current standards and curricula? What, if any, are example learning trajectories? And are there example lessons or curricula being developed? And over the last 5 years, there's been a number of programs across the US developing materials for this, and I can't list them all in this slide. And what I can say now today as a snapshot is that quantum exists explicitly in the chemistry curricula. It's already taught, it's just not connected to quantum information science. It feels more like quantum of the 20th century, which is fine. It just means that I think students and teachers may be unaware of the connections to this very exciting field. So atomic structure, energy, photon superposition. So I think there's a lot of activity that can be done to really support chemistry classes and chemistry teachers and impact a lot of students. And I think that is probably the most near-term formal work that can be done with large impact at scale. In math classes, students learn probability and vectors, but it is not tied to quantum information science. No surprise there. I think this is an opportunity to talk about real world applications of probability and vector math. But that one, I think, would be there's a lot of development and changes to math curricula coming. And I think this one is a really important one we do, but I don't know how long this one will take. In physics, which less than half of all graduating seniors take in the US, there are clear connections through the NGSS framework to the electromagnetic spectrum and waves and information and cross-cutting concepts on systems. This one, I think, has a high impact because there are a lot of excited physics teachers out there who maybe have taken quantum, are just really excited about it and feel like it lends itself to their course. But navigating how it fits in has been tricky. And so I think the framework has been really helpful to physics teachers specifically at present. And then computer science is in a completely different spot. While computer science is required by many places, actually less than 8% of high school, maybe it's 10% now, students are actually enrolled in a computer science course during their high school experience. And there's a lot of questions of, where does quantum computing fit in? Because Like you're not going to really ask a student to program a quantum computer in a computer science class. And so this area has been an area of active work by my co-PI, Diana Franklin, who's a computer science education person. I think it's coming. I think it's going to look a little different than the other ones where they already have some foundational science concepts to bake into. Um, Okay, so this work is publicly available, the Q12 framework. It's at the bottom of here. Some of the links to where the numbers I list here, where they come from, are also at the bottom of the screen. Happy to have people look at the framework, give updates to it. The CS has gone through 2 iterations. I definitely think there can be updates to the other ones as well as curricula that's been researched and validated come online. And so we have hope to update some of the information on the Q12's website soon, but I would say the framework probably needs another revision. Okay, so I mentioned the formal stuff, and now there's also the informal stuff. And so one of the other things the community said that would be really helpful to them was having a way to have prepackaged informal fun activities right now. So if a teacher is like, okay, it's day before a break, let's do something in the class that's different and fun, might connect to some of the science they've been learning. What can we do? And Quantime is sort of our version to help with this. And Quantime really takes we what we do is collect and curate everything that we can find that are quantum activities from the community, and we work with content creators to try to package them up in a way that it doesn't require teachers to have formal professional development to execute, and then share them with as many teachers as possible. Okay, so, but these activities are not generally created by the Q12 partnership, like leadership. They are outside of separate grants that me and Diana or Chandraleka might have. They are created by a mix of industry, nonprofit, state. There's a lot of people's work in here. So this is really a way to pull all that together and get as broad a dissemination as possible. Um, so these are actually old numbers. I think it's more than 1,000 teachers, and I think it's the number of participants across online, hands, and web-based data orders and all that is over 70,000 at this point. It's gone on for a couple of years, and we've taken a lot of data on how best to run this program. And this year, we changed it to be where we help local and regional state coordinators or science representatives or people interested in this space run this locally in their own areas. And we no longer tie it to World Quantum Day. It can happen any point in the year. And we just try to work with different people across the country to deploy this in their state or in their school district or in their local school. And so the idea here is there are just informal resources that lower the barrier. And here are some of the topics. So this year, when we move to this more regionally driven model that we think has been quite successful and is probably the way forward, we created choice boards and other teacher-facing materials with our partners to try to make this as easy as possible for teachers to bring to their classroom. So we partnered with Colorado in January. We did Montana State, I think, did this in April with a bunch of teachers. The Chicago Quantum Exchange did it in April. I think in March we had a meeting. We helped support the American Physical Society's Global Physics Summit. In February, we did New Mexico, and we even made quantum themed Valentines. And so, we're hoping that starting next year, we can partner with more organizations to just bring this to whoever wants it and have as many resources publicly available as possible so that teachers can just do quantum whenever it fits their schedule. We also, as part of the Q12 partnership supported by the Qubit Collaboratory, developed a set of career resources to couple to these informal and formal activities. Because the third thing we heard from people was that, okay, it's nice to have all this activities and science content, but students need to have more information about careers. So the LQC funded an effort for us to develop online information around quantum careers aimed at middle school and high school learners and teachers. and then also have a set of videos. Now, the videos are not available. We do have videos from Intel and other groups, APS and other groups that are on the website and available, but there will be an additional set of videos sponsored by LQC that will made available to that are aimed at middle schoolers, highlighting different people working in this area. But currently, you can go to the Q12's website and you can look about careers. We have some information about from Bureau of Labor Standards on salaries associated with this. And this is really material that's aimed at these younger people because I know career information exists out there, but it's largely been aimed at undergraduate or graduate students. So this is really taking it and putting it in the language for students. And so we'd love feedback on this. We're still working on updating it, but this is available now on our website. And we really, I can't underscore or underline, highlight, italicize the role of role models in this, which is why we really are trying to make as many videos as possible to really highlight the different careers and different people that are working in quantum information in in the year 2025, which is very different than what it looked like in the 1920s. And so we want to highlight that this is a field that has lots of opportunities, and maybe you don't need to know everything about quantum to work in it, or maybe you want to, and that's your jam. And we just want to make sure that people know what's available to them. And so we really emphasize the role of role models. So I appreciated the mention of that earlier by Katie. And so in the spirit of that, I want to take a few minutes and talk about my role models. I know it's a little non sequitur, but for International Year, which I've been involved in a lot, we've had a lot of discussions about this role model issue. And I just decided that almost every talk I can, any talk I can fit this in, I'm going to fit this into. So I want to talk about my role models a little. I have had many in my life, but two that I think are relevant here are Catherine Gebbie and Catherine Burr Blodgett. So I will say Catherine Gebbie is my role model, and her role model was Catherine Burr Blodgett. But Catherine Gebbie was a government employee in the US at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. She worked there for many years. She was a scientist before she became a government administrator. And she was amazing, actually. And under her, she wanted people to just be able to do science. And I like last week was talking with a Nobel laureate at an event I was at, and he mentioned her as part of the reason he was able to do the science he did. And in fact, under her tenure as a government administrator, she was behind the scenes supporting his work and others, and four people earned Nobel Prizes from the laboratory that she oversaw. And I think that's a testament to how important it is not just to have great scientists, but also to have great administrators working in these agencies. And she was dedicated to having more women in science and even have more opportunities for parents to have better childcare. So she was lovely, and I got to know her later in her life. And I asked her if I could write about her, and she said, "No, I want you to talk about my aunt." So here I am fulfilling that obligation, which is her role model was Catherine Burr Blodgett, who was the first woman scientist hired by General Electric, and she worked on thin films. And she was also the first woman to earn a PhD in physics from Cambridge. And so while she mostly worked in chemistry during her life, her PhD was in physics. And she also worked on de-icing materials for aircraft during the war, which saved many lives. And so I just think it's really important to have these legacies of role models that pass from generation to generation. And I have more role models than this, and I'm sure you all do, but I wanted to share their stories because I think the more we talk about our role models, then the more students out there can see themselves in their future careers. And with that, I want to just say a few words about the persistent gaps that continue for quantum education. So I talked about formal framework, informal resources, and careers and role models as being kind of the ingredients of quantum education. Yet right now, we still have some persistent gaps. We're a pretty young initiative nationwide. Some of those gaps include most of the resources are in English only and don't translate well automatically through AI. So we need more multilingual resources. We need more chemistry and math and quantum sensing and networking and entanglement resources and activities, whether they're through analogy or through exact, simulation or science experiments. We need more of this there's a lot of duplication on polarization and wave particle duality. So if you're somebody making activities or thinking, what can my institution do, or what can I do to contribute, I would encourage you to look at developing activities and curricula in these areas or finding ways to partner to do so. Need more stuff on careers. And then currently, there's a lot of development in quantum computing activities and resources, as well as games. Games are great. I would encourage us to have more. I just think we needed more different topics than we currently have available to students. And with that, I'll say I was recently awarded another grant to expand Quantime. And so some of the things we will do will be to target some of those expanded resources and help the community develop them. But what the program will look like, just as a teaser, is we will combine Quantime with the careers and the info on learning opportunities in the community and try to package this up in a way that can reach a broader set of teachers and also help connect to local coordinators and decision makers. And so this builds on the work we did with Colorado and Montana and with New Mexico and with the Midwest to try to have this available in all 50 states. And so we will work on improving our inventory to have materials available and translated. We will recruit new partners and try and work with them to have more cohorts of 10 to 20 teachers in every state, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, and we'll hold monthly office hours for participants with partners. And this is meant to really see if we can build local capacity across the US. So this is the goal of the new project. And with that, I think I'll just stop there and say there's many people in this. It takes a village, and would be happy to chat and answer questions. Thank you so much.